I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Donald Trump is without doubt one of the most polarizing presidents in history. His supporters praise his pro-business policies, economic expansion, and record low unemployment, while his critics argue that his policies disproportionately favored corporations and the wealthy, while increasing national debt and inequality. Fortunately or unfortunately, Trump has been re-elected into office, but the economy today presents a stark contrast to when he first took office in 2017. Inflation is now persistently high, interest rates has risen sharply, and the national debt has increased to levels unseen since World War II. As a Canadian, we typically like to shit on Trump for his antics, but for all the headlines and headshots he's in, we never examine if he's actually a good president. So in this video, I'll be reviewing his policies and comparing it to history to see if his current and past approach will actually make America great again.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
When Donald Trump was elected in 2016, he inherited an economy that was stable but sluggish. One of the key indicators of economic health, gross domestic product, which measures the total value of goods and services within a country, was growing at 1.8% per year. While this reflected consistent moderate expansion, it was slower than the 2.6% observed in the previous year. For reference, during the post-World War II boom, GDP growth averaged around 5% per year, fueled by industrial expansion, government investment, and a rapidly growing middle class. This time period is often referred to as the golden age of capitalism. Compared to that era, the 2016 economy felt significantly weaker. Another positive sign was that the unemployment rate stood at 4.7%, a figure considered to be close to the natural rate of unemployment. In general, the natural rate of unemployment suggests a healthy job market, where most people who want to find work can find employment. But there aren't so many people employed that companies need to raise wages to attract new talent. This is important because if all companies increase their wages at the same time, the additional money in the economy could be the cause for inflation. However, just looking at the unemployment figures doesn't actually tell the full story. Many of the jobs created after the 2008 financial crisis were low-wage service jobs rather than the higher-paying manufacturing or white-collar jobs that historically supported the middle class. As a result, even though people were employed, their wages often were too low to afford housing, healthcare, or other essential costs. For many Americans, the economy felt much weaker than the numbers suggested, creating dissatisfaction with the status quo. At the same time, inflation, a measure of how quickly prices for goods and services rise, was at 2.1%. This level of inflation is considered to be moderate and is an indication that consumer demand was growing without causing extreme price increases. In addition to the concerns around wages and the cost of living, there was also growing unease about the national debt burden. By 2016, national debt had reached 103.6% of GDP, meaning the federal government owed more than the entire economy produced in a given year. This was the highest level in over 50 years, raising concerns about long-term financial stability. High debt levels limit the government's ability to respond to future crises. Although the economy was moving along like it normally does, there was this strong sense that the economy on paper wasn't reflecting the typical American's day-to-day experience. This created a deep sense of economic anxiety, particularly among the working-class voters. Trump's campaign tapped into these frustrations, promising to renegotiate trade deals, bring back American manufacturing, and restore economic prosperity. Oh, and we can't forget about
I would build a great wall, and nobody builds walls better than me, believe me.
After winning his presidential race, he planned on fulfilling his campaign promises by focusing on three main economic policies: tax cuts, deregulation, and trade protectionism. But did they have the intended effect? One of Trump's most significant policies was the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, which slashed corporate tax rates from 35% to 21% and reduced the individual income tax rate. Trump argued that lowering taxes would stimulate business investment, create jobs, and raise wages. This policy was rooted in the theory of supply-side economics, often referred to as trickle-down economics, the belief that reducing taxes on corporations and the wealthy would spur economic growth that would eventually trickle down to benefit the middle and working class. However, past administrations have implemented similar tax policies only to see their long-term effect include rising inequality and an increase in national debt. In the 1980s, the US economy was struggling with stagflation, a combination of high inflation and low economic growth, largely caused by the oil crises of the 1970s. When Reagan first took office, he promised to revitalize the economy with bold tax cuts and deregulation. His economic plan, later known as Reaganomics, was also rooted in supply-side economics. In 1981, Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which lowered the top individual tax rate from 70% to 50% and included major corporate tax breaks. Then in 1986, the Tax Reform Act cut the top tax rate even further to 28% while eliminating many tax loopholes. Businesses enjoyed enormous tax savings, and the stock market responded with record gains. For much of the decade, economic growth accelerated and the unemployment rate declined. However, the benefits were not evenly distributed. The wealthiest Americans saw significant income gains, while wages for the middle class grew much slower. Income inequality widened sharply as the tax cuts disproportionately favored high-income earners. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, his economic policies had created a decade of growth, lowered unemployment, and tamed inflation. But they had also left the country with a deeply divided economy, one which the rich had gotten richer while the middle class hadn't. When Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, he promised that his approach would be different. Unlike previous tax cuts which had contributed to inequality and debt, Trump claimed that his plan would deliver sustained wage growth for workers. At first, the results seemed promising. Businesses, particularly large corporations, saw record profits, and the stock market experienced a major surge. The logic behind corporate tax cuts was with lower tax burdens, companies could reinvest their savings into expansion, higher wages, and job creation. However, much of the additional revenue went towards stock buybacks rather than wage increases or hiring more workers. Stock buybacks occur when companies use their profits to repurchase their own shares, reducing the number of shares in circulation and driving up stock prices. This benefits investors and corporate executives who often receive compensation in the form of stock options. But it does little to help the typical employee. In 2018 alone, companies spent over $800 billion on stock buybacks, while wage growth for the average worker was unnoticeable. Meanwhile, the national debt continued to rise. By the end of Trump's first term, the debt had climbed to over 105.8% of GDP, fueled in part by lost revenue from tax cuts and increases in federal spending. The wall. Just like in the 1980s, the immediate gains from tax cuts came at the expense of long-term financial stability. As with Reagan's policies, the Trump tax cuts disproportionately benefited the wealthy. While the middle-class families did receive modest tax breaks, the biggest savings went to high-income earners and corporations. The belief that tax cuts would pay for themselves through economic growth did not materialize as promised, leading to a growing budget deficit.
We've begun the most far-reaching regulatory reform in American history.
Another major part of Trump's economic strategy was deregulation. His administration rolled back environmental protections, financial regulation, and restrictions on fossil fuel production, arguing that eliminating regulation would make it easier for businesses to grow, reduce costs, and stimulate economic activity. Trump positioned himself as a pro-business president, believing that government regulations stifled entrepreneurship and economic expansion. Deregulation, when done in moderation and with oversight, can indeed lead to short-term economic gains. Removing bureaucratic barriers can allow businesses to operate more efficiently. However, excessive deregulation, particularly in finance, energy, and environmental policies, can create long-term economic instability, environmental degradation, and financial crises. To understand how Trump's policies fit into the broader economic landscape, it is important to examine two historical examples of deregulation, both successful and disastrous. For much of the 20th century, the U.S. airline industry was heavily regulated by the federal government, with strict controls over ticket price, routes, and competition. The government set fares and determined which airlines could operate which route. All of this regulation is what made flying so glamorous back then. It was truly only for the wealthiest of individuals. Adjusted for inflation, the typical airline ticket from Los Angeles to Boston would cost approximately $4,539.24 per person in today's money, and it would have taken 15 hours and 15 minutes with 12 stops along the way. In 1978, under President Jimmy Carter, Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act, which which eliminated federal control over fares and routes, allowing airlines to compete freely. The reason why competition is good for consumers is because airline tickets are what economists like to call substitute goods. This means if a traveler buys a ticket from one airline, they won't purchase another ticket for the same trip from a different airline, because they only have one ass. As a result, competing airlines are incentivized to lower prices and expand services to attract as many new customers as possible. Under these conditions, budget carriers like Southwest Airlines thrived, making flying accessible to everyone. However, there were also downsides. Increased competition led to cost-cutting measures, including lowering wages for airline employees and bankruptcies for inefficient firms. While consumers benefited, workers faced instability as the industry became more competitive. The airline deregulation story shows that reducing government oversight can create more efficient market outcomes, but not all industries react to deregulation the same way. For most of the 20th century, US banking was heavily regulated to prevent financial speculation and economic instability. After the Great Depression of the 1930s, the government put into place strict banking regulations, most notably the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which separated commercial banking from investment banking. The goal was to prevent banks from using ordinary customer deposits to fund risky investments. However, by the 1990s, many believed that these regulations were outdated and limiting financial innovation. Under Bill Clinton, key parts of the Glass-Steagall Act were repealed, allowing commercial banks to engage in investment banking activities. This deregulation allowed banks to take on more risk, leading to rapid innovation. With less regulation, banks made record profits in the early 2000s. Home ownership soared as banks offered easy credit and subprime mortgages to millions of Americans. However, the lack of oversight led to reckless lending practices, as banks issued risky mortgages to borrowers who couldn't afford them. These risky loans were then bundled into a type of trading vehicle known as a mortgage-backed security, and sold to investors as virtually risk-free. After all, nobody would ever default on their mortgage, right? The 2008 financial crisis led to the collapse of major financial institutions, mass layoffs, and a global recession. It was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. It wiped out over $10 trillion in wealth and led to the loss of nearly 9 million jobs. To add insult to injury, the government had to use taxpayers' money to bail out the very banks and corporations that had fueled the crisis in the first place, all in a desperate effort to prevent further economic collapse. When Trump took office in 2017, he followed the Reagan-era approach to deregulation. His administration reversed or weakened more than 100 environmental protections, including rules on carbon emissions, water pollution, and fossil fuel production. Trump argued that these regulations burdened businesses and slowed economic growth, particularly in the coal, oil, and gas industries. In the short term, this helped fossil fuel companies increase profits and expand production. However, relaxing environmental standards would lead to increased pollution and climate risk. The cost to reverse these damages caused by pollution will likely outweigh the economic gain in the future. In the financial sector, Trump loosened oversight on banks and investment firms, rolling back parts of the Dodd-Frank Act, a set of financial regulations implemented after the 2008 financial crisis to prevent another meltdown. While banks enjoyed higher profits and fewer compliance costs, removing key protections could encourage excessive risk-taking, making another financial crisis more likely in the future. Lastly, a particularly controversial aspect of Trump's deregulation strategy was his approach to consumer protection laws, or the lack thereof. His administration weakened the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, an agency created after the 2008 financial crisis to protect consumers from essentially being outright scammed by corporations. Under Trump, the CFPB reduced enforcement actions, rolled back regulations on payday lenders, and made it easier for banks to engage in risky lending practices.
Well, the United States has been taken advantage of by other countries.
One of the most defining aspects of Donald Trump's economic policy was his aggressive use of trade protectionism, particularly in his trade war with China. For decades, China has been accused of unfair trade practices, including currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, and government subsidies that gave Chinese companies an unfair advantage. Trump argued that imposing tariffs on Chinese goods would force China to play by the rules and bring manufacturing jobs back to the US. Between 2018 and 2019, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on over $300 billion worth of Chinese imports, aiming to make Chinese goods more expensive and less competitive, while generating tax revenue. However, because many US industries relied heavily on Chinese-made materials, the tariffs significantly increased production costs. As a result, American businesses had little choice but to pass on these expenses to consumers. China then responded to the US by imposing their own retaliatory tariffs on $110 billion worth of US exports, further escalating trade tensions. Unlike what Trump claimed, the tariffs ended up placing the financial burden mostly on American businesses and consumers. According to estimates from Moody Analytics and Bloomberg Economics, the trade war had already cost America nearly 300,000 jobs in 2019 and an estimated $316 billion by the end of 2020. Unlike 2016, when tax cuts and deregulation had room to stimulate the economy without immediate inflationary consequences, by Trump's re-election in 2024, the economy was operating at or near full capacity. Inflation remains above the Federal Reserve's target of 2%, and unemployment rate is at a historic low. Not to mention, interest rates has risen to 4.48%, a level unseen in years. These conditions means that any additional stimulus could risk further overheating the economy, rather than fostering sustainable growth. Overheating occurs when an economy is growing too fast, causing rising inflation, excessive demand, and unsustainable economic activity. This happens when businesses and consumers spend and invest at a pace that exceeds the economy's ability to supply goods and services, leading to shortages, wage pressures, and rapidly increasing prices. Key signs of overheating include high inflation, labor shortages, rising prices, asset bubbles, and supply chain disruptions, all of which are becoming increasingly evident in the current economic landscape. Trump either isn't aware of this, or he recognizes the issue but refuses to cut back on expansionary policies because it would be politically unpopular. Much like his first campaign, Trump's 2024 re-election platform focused on further tax cuts and trade protectionism as key economic policies. If Trump pursues further tax cuts, it would only put more money in the hands of businesses and consumers, stimulating demand. However, the economy is already at full employment. This additional money would not lead to a surge in new hires or production. Instead, it would only drive prices higher, increasing inflation. This dynamic is a fundamental principle of macroeconomics. When demand outpaces supply, prices rise. Basically, it means that everybody has too much money and there isn't enough goods to buy. The inflation will only be further exacerbated by the trade wars that Trump's planning on entering. Currently, he has begun trade wars with Canada, Mexico, China, and the European Union. If we learn from history, this will only cause retaliation, driving up costs for imported goods and resulting in an estimated $1,200 increase in annual expenses for the average American household. Trump probably knows this and is only using tariffs as a bargaining chip, but it's like trying to kill a spider with a lighter at a gas station. With US being such a large market, tariffs will likely achieve the short-term concessions he's looking for, but they risk sending a message to the global trading partners that the US is an unpredictable and unstable force in international trade. As a result, other countries may begin shifting their supply chains and diversifying trading partners to hedge against future risk of tariff escalations. Businesses that once relied on American markets may start investing in alternative trade routes, weakening the US's leverage and diminishing its role as the world's dominant economic power. In 2024, Trump's administration faces a fundamentally different economic reality than it did in 2017. The policies that once spurred economic growth are now more likely to cause economic distortion. The question is no longer about how to stimulate the economy, but rather how to manage the risks associated with inflation, high interest rates, and trade disruptions. Unlike his first term when tax cuts and deregulation could be implemented without immediate negative consequences, in his second term, these same policies carry significant risks of overheating the economy, driving up prices, and increasing long-term financial instability. Like all economic policies, Donald Trump's policies left in its wake winners and losers across various sectors. His first term saw aggressive tax cuts, deregulation, and trade protectionism, which helped businesses expand and fueled economic optimism. However, these policies favored corporations and high-income earners more than the average worker, widening the gap between the wealthy and the middle class. Ultimately, whether Trump's policies has made America great again largely depends on your perspective. If you're among those hurt by the trade war, whether a farmer losing access to export markets or a consumer paying higher prices, you may view his policies as harmful. On the other hand, if you're a corporate executive benefiting from tax cuts or deregulation, you may view his presidency more favorably. The reality is that we all experience the economy differently, shaped by our own circumstances and social circles. It makes it challenging to evaluate economic policies objectively, especially when you're the one feeling the consequences firsthand. In my opinion, Trump's policies and unpredictability risk undermining America's global influence and weakening its economy in the long run. If other countries lose trust in the US as a reliable trade partner and ally, they may forge new trade agreements and military alliances that diminish America's role on the world stage. That said, only time will tell whether these concerns will materialize over the next 4 years. For now, thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more economic and business insights. I hope to see you again soon. See ya.